Thanks very much for having us. Very pleased to have Dan here as well. So I'm the founder of Entity X, where we specialize in cultural intelligence and cultural activation. So we're really interested in how we capture data about what's happening in a human culture right now, and we integrate that broadly with the advertising ecosystem, both as a signal about what's happening and to make findings addressable. And we'll go through some examples in a minute, but what's really exciting for me is how we're working with Ipsos to combine these capabilities with the amazing research and measurement data that Ipsos has.
Thanks for that, Tom. So Dan Wong Chi Man, Global Head of Audience Measurement, possibly the longest surname with the longest title in the world. Essentially, what we do at Ipsos is obviously provide insights into real human behaviour. So what we will share with you today, and following on some of the topics for those of you who were in the room before, is really to show how generative AI techniques actually doesn't have to be a black box, really showcase actually how we can target people in the real world and understand actually if it is a seminal moment, a fad, or actually something that's just an ongoing theme that we should be thinking about. So we're here to talk about AI a little bit. AI has all the answers, right? No, it doesn't. Shock horror. I think when we're thinking about AI, when we're thinking about technology, really consider it as a tool. One of the things that I always tell my teams is think of it like a calculator. There are sometimes, when it's faster to do 10% in your head. Yes, some of us can still do 10% in our heads. Believe it or not, it can be done, just move the decimal point. But there are times also when you should use the calculator. So in that analogy, there are times when we should be thinking about when we're using LLMs and AI technology. But just like the calculator, sometimes we might hit the wrong buttons. Or it might be, if you've got one of the old solar calculators, maybe it's fading and you can't quite read the numbers. You don't quite understand what that number is. So the real key of what we want to show today is really understanding context. Because however you're using these tools, it's critical that we don't forget to think, and it's critical that we are really thinking, does it make sense? Because these tools can help us, they can make us faster, they can make us smarter if used in the right way, and if we take the time to think, does it actually come back to relevance? So there are lots of things that we're seeing in culture. There's lots of things that AI can help us understand. But the critical thing to know is that it's a part of the picture. Because at the end of the day, with AI, we can understand some moments, but it's critical to know what is the data standing upon. Because every single piece of technology now gives a data point. Everyone actually has data. You yourselves own data, believe it or not. Not a lot of us actually control that. That's something that we should be considering and thinking about. But more importantly, every single data source has a strength and weakness. So it's really important actually that when we start feeding these tools, and Tom, you will talk a little bit in a bit about brains and vats, which I'll let you explain a bit more on. But I think it's really critical to understand where that's come from, what is the strength, what is the weakness, does it make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think of LLMs like brains and vats. They're kind of these incredibly potent reasoning cognition machines, but they're not plugged into the wider world particularly well, except through whatever tools they have access to. So an LLM can tell you about culture and what's happening in culture if you ask it questions, but you don't really know where that data is coming from, what it's grounded in. And grounding LLMs in data that's well understood is really critical. We know that to get results out of LLMs, it's important to feed them the right context, right? So there's a lot of the stuff that's happening around agentic engineering and harnesses and workflows, etc., is about how you shuttle the right information into the context window available to the LLM so that it can do its reasoning for you. It can give you answers that are grounded in the stuff you care about. And when it comes to reasoning about culture, it's really important. We found a way of grounding our LLMs in solid data that's come from known sources about culture. And it's sort of there's an ethical element as well, I guess, which is, for example, different cultural backgrounds won't necessarily be reflected in what an LLM comes up with by itself or what it gets through using web search tools, for example. So plugging it into a proper source of data, such as Ipsos's measurement data. We ground it in data relating to Wikipedia, relating to web content consumption, and making that data available for LLMs in a way that they can use. So we use knowledge graph technology, which LLMs can work with really nicely. And it's a way of representing data that isn't hidden from the humans. It's a way of representing data in a very explicable, understandable way. And so bringing these technologies together to package culture in the right way for LLMs to then be able to reason about it is really important. And the data that Ipsos has is foundational to that.
I think the critical thing, I talked a little bit about the strengths and weaknesses of data, but more importantly, is to think about how that data relates back to people. And so some of the things that we're going to show to you today is really actually real data that's come from people who have opted in, who have decided and wanting to share, and that it can be done in an ethical manner. But what I think is really critical when you think about the marketing space is there's a trifecta, essentially, in terms of things to think about. Creativity is really, really important. If you've got good creative, it will capture attention, it will capture, and it will drive sales. But you can have the best creative in the world. If it's not seen, if it's not in the right moment, if it's not in the right mindset, it will fail. Which is why in today's world, when you think about advertising, thinking about what is powering and helping you make those choices, one, in terms of how you're creating a creative, but two, in terms of how you're actually then delivering that creative is really, really critical. And what AI essentially helps is one, facilitate that process, speed it up, but also give us more control and a greater understanding.
So I'm going to show you an example now. This represents the bringing together of Ipsos data and the data that NTDX has from, like I say, web content consumption, etc., and how we join those data sets together. So we start with a high-level set of concepts, and this particular set of high-level concepts relates to the theme of wellness. And you'll see there concepts such as movement and biohacking, pharma, etc. And these might be the sort of areas that a particular segment or audience that's grounded in panel data will be particularly interested in. And what we do with that, and using our machine learning and AI technology, is to be able to expand those out into much more specific topics that are of relevance right now within those different areas. And not just the topics that are relevant, but how they connect to one another. So you'll see that, for example, movement connects to mind and body. There are various relationships between these different areas that are important for people right now who are interested in engaging with these sorts of themes. But I think where it gets really interesting is where we layer sort of the emerging cultural level on top of that. So here are a couple of examples. There are many more of these. But if we look outside the space of topics that are explicitly about wellness, we find these wider networks of kind of co-occurring interests that reveal these really interesting cultural clusters that themselves are relevant for how we think about creatively addressing an audience and activating against an audience. So for example, we have the longevity optimizers. I guess that's sort of your West Coast tech bros who are interested in biohacking and some of the pharmaceutical techniques and measurement of bodily capabilities, etc. Another extreme is what we've perhaps slightly denigratingly referred to as Pilates princesses. The classic relationship between Pilates and Lululemon leggings and certain kinds of dietary activity, certain forms of wellness. And these form very distinct clusters. And I've just picked two kind of almost overly simplistic, obvious examples. But it's really interesting how, given almost any space of topics grounded in panel audience measurement, we can then discover these kinds of cultural themes that are either hot right now, emerging right now, are present in past content we can look at. There's loads of ways in which this becomes relevant for then brand decision making particularly.
And I think what machine learning has really helped us to do is really bring together those disparate data sets to really give you an overall understanding of a human being. Because at the end of the day, we're all very different. We all act in different ways. And actually, things like today it's raining, for instance, can change how we behave and how we think. And so with machine learning, actually what we can do is really understand how those impacts are changing us and how the way we behave.
Just one more example. So this is sort of diving into a particular area around weight loss and GLP-1, so drugs like Ozempic and Wegovy, etc. So analysing how the kind of content that consumers are engaging with Reveals, again, various clusters. This is more like a kind of almost classic funnel. So there's engagement with content where people are interested in this theme, they're a bit worried about it, they're following celebrities who might be sharing their experiences with weight loss drugs, for example. There's the next stage where people are actually interested in going further themselves and they're researching the topic. And then finally, there's a whole community of people who are actively using these drugs, and they're interested in, I don't know, optimizing their dosage or dealing with price rises and that sort of thing.
And I think what's really interesting is when you think about the marketing funnel, quite often we think of the funnel, but we see the funnel on a page and it looks like a really long chart, right? A really long diagram. In today's world, that funnel actually is completely collapsed. So someone can think about something, see about something, and actually activate and buy that all in one moment, all in one day. So what's critical actually is understanding those user journeys, because before, the historical way was you still need to build brand reputation. Don't get me wrong, brand reputation is very, very important. But with that, the ability to act and transact is happening thanks to mobile devices, essentially. So before, you'd go into a store, you'd hear about it, you'd see it, you'd read about it, you'd think about it, you'd go into store. Today, that same process is happening, but it's happening instantaneously. So this is where machine learning, where the data that's out there can really help target and reach people in a very much faster way.
And I know you've told me in the past, Dan, about how significant that is for better informing marketers and what they're doing. Yeah. So understanding in advance for planning, strategy, the creative content production, the understanding how you get those messages into the right place. This is all kind of bubbles back up. So.
And it completely comes back down to context, right? You know, you take someone like Hermes. Hermes do a lot of contextual targeting, for instance. Today, no doubt, there will be adverts for their umbrellas. But you need to also understand in those moments if it's right or not. And so that's why context is really critical and context is really key.
I think another really interesting feature of this data as well is the different kind of timeframes over which you can use it. So on the left is a chart that came from some research we did with ITV that was looking at the impact of linear TV ads on people's awareness of things. So this chart came from looking at, I think it was 33,000 different Apple iPhone related TV ads over the course of the year, and minute by minute, on average, sampled across the 33,000 occurrences, what impact that had on online consumption of content relating to the thing being advertised. And the interesting thing was, particularly with something that's quite high profile with strong cultural resonance like that, is you get a really strong response, like a few minutes, reliably a few minutes after the TV ad airs. And this isn't about traffic to brand site or traffic to shopping sites. This is general kind of web-wide consumption of information about that product, about that brand. It's a really, really immediate response. The other chart on the right relates to tracking changes around how people engage around healthcare, particularly around January. So post-Christmas, traditionally it was about dry January, Veganuary, etc. And you can see these changes in how people engage with these topics morphing over time. So in particular, there was a big move towards more of the tech approach to wellness. So less about holistic dieting, less about holistic gut health, etc., and much more towards tech-driven things. And I think the fact that this data responds in various ways is quite interesting, and it opens up lots of different opportunities. So one of the things I like about this data set is it's available historically as well as being addressable in the moment. So something like the TV response, we can look back and say, well, what kind of response do your TV ads generate? And then plan to do something about that going forward. So even though something happens in the moment, it's not the case that the data is only there and available and usable in the moment. You can look back and then do some planning and strategy around it, which I think is important for making it actionable.
I think the thing to also think about is data is very powerful, but data is very powerful only if it's used in the right ways. And I think from an advertising standpoint, the thing to really consider and think about is it true to you and is it true to your brand as well? Because you can see that the trend is in January, people are thinking about their health. But if you as a brand or you as your product don't normally talk and convey that message, it can actually also have a negative effect. So it's really critical about understanding when is the right moments for you Yes, you can be zeitgeisty. Yes, you can drive impact. But in today's world, audiences will call you out. With kind of AI, with kind of Google, with the internet, it's very quick for people to say, is that true that what you're saying? Are you actually living and breathing what you're actually pushing? So it's critical in terms of messaging to think about, does it resonate?
And I think the other bit that's important for me is the data that we're analysing here is kind of a wall of noise. So finding the right way to filter it and slice and dice it, partly so you can then do things like feed it into an LLM to get it to help analyse, understand the data. But how you segment it in the first place is really important. So something like the ITV piece we worked on a couple of years ago, but I think what's really interesting is combining that with, for example, like the panel data. So the lens through which you're looking at this and drawing conclusions and findings is based on some actually explicitly grounded representation of a particular desirable target audience, segmentation or whatever. And the fact that it comes from panel data means you are grounding it in actual real human beings and how they care about things, how they go about what they do, etc.
Yeah, and I think there's a trade-off because in the world that we live in today, I talked about the fact that there's lots and lots of different data streams, there's lots and lots of different data sources. At the end of the day, what's really critical is that ability to calibrate. So big data is brilliant because it gives you lots and lots of insights really, really quickly. But at the same time, big data is always biased. For instance, believe it or not everyone has a mobile phone. So a lot of big data which comes from things that are not actually related back to people. It's actually more, is the TV screen on? Has an ad been served? So again, thinking about where that data has come from, how it's being impacted and used is really, really important. And so I think, in terms of thinking about where we can do this, in terms of thinking about what is that strategic edge, I think I was talking, this is more for you actually, but I think it's really understanding those real world crossings as to what makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's, again, in the data, you see kind of different characteristic fingerprints or patterns of stuff happening in culture. So you get things that are just momentary spikes when something of interest happens, but you also get events that kind of scale and scale and scale. So as an example, I don't know, when the Among Us game, I think it was when the TV series came out, started escaping out of gaming into a much broader popular culture, being able to see signals like that at the time they're happening is really powerful. And for us, using data that comes from addressable media is also a really important part of it, because then as advertisers, we can do something about it. We can understand, cluster, create creative in the right way, deliver content in the right way, in a way that's aligned. I know that's something that's key to your interests.
And I think, data is only, I keep saying about context, and I'll keep reiterating this, because at the end of the day, data is just a number. Without taking the time to think, actually, it's irrelevant. So if I was to say in Asia right now, and I was to say 8, is 8 good or bad? Most Asians will probably say 8 is good, right? Because 8 is a lucky number. If I was to say to you 8 out of 10, 8 out of 10, you'd probably say it's quite good. 8 out of 100, you'd probably say it's quite bad. Flip it the other way. 8 out of 100 means that there's high opportunity. So understanding that context of what those signals means, trying to relate it back to human behavior is really critical in today's world. Because what's happening with AI is actually we're starting to lose the power of thinking. And so actually, whilst it can help us, we need to really kind of think about what is actually the broader story from it.
I think the point about context is interesting as well. I was thinking about the earlier talk, talking about ethics and responsibility, etc. So the more that we can derive signal about interests and deliver that into activation based on something like context that doesn't require PII, it doesn't require IP addresses or cookies or personal tracking, that in itself, I think, is broadly a good thing. So in the case of using panel data, it is grounded in some individuals, but it's fully consented individuals.
Completely.
But the mechanism then of enriching that and delivering it does not involve any violation of privacy because of drawing on the power of context. Kind of decoupling it from the individuals is really, really important.
And then you can use kind of advanced statistical techniques such as creating a synthetic population. If you go back and you think about COVID, for instance, how was a vaccine created so quickly was thanks to synthetic populations. And in today's world, with the data, thanks to AI, building a synthetic population allows you to have a greater understanding if you have data that's grounded to the population or the target that you're trying to reach.
And actually, there's a whole emerging space that probably now isn't the time to get into, but I think it's really interesting, some of the stuff Ipsos is working on around synthetic audiences, but in a way that is, again, grounded in real data and isn't just guesswork.
Yeah, I think the word synthetic is actually a bit of a misnomer, because actually what it is more, or how some people in the industry are using it, is very much more like a virtual population. So if you think about kind of Sims from old, that's essentially what a synthetic population is. And so it can really help you model, understand how people are maybe flowing. So if you're thinking out of home, for instance, how people are walking past or going down in the underground. But also the word synthetic, there are lots of ways that it's unfortunately being used in bad ways, because what's happening is they're creating data from nothing. And so actually it's meaningless. So again, understanding kind of how that's been created is really fundamental.
And I think, yeah, if there's one of the themes of this conversation, it's with the power of modern LLMs, you can do an awful lot on a foundation of nothing, but at some point that bites because it's on a foundation of nothing. You don't understand where information was sourced or what's hallucinated or not, etc. So plugging all of these things into an explicit, represented data source that's comprehensible to human beings, that can be audited, validated, etc., is super important.
And it's an obvious one, but it's something that we mustn't forget is, what are we trying to achieve? Why are we trying to do it? Too often right now, actually what marketers are trying to do is they're just chasing big numbers, whereas actually understanding why, what that number is, or what are you trying to measure, changes the approaches that you might take. And so, when it comes to targeting, I think there are three critical elements that you should think about. The first one is the audience, obviously. We as people, we are the ones that still decide what we buy. We are still the ones that decide what we consume. We are the ones that decide to look at advertising in that way. People will tell you that agentic can do it. Yes, agentic does, but we are still in control of that. So with that, think about your audience. The creative element and creative aspects of it is really fundamental. Like I said, creative is very strong. It can capture attention. If you use it in the right moments, it can either shock in a positive way or it can shock in a negative way. And then the last one, and where those three really come across, is that context. And if you get those right, that's when advertising really, really works.
And it's funny, actually, in the context of this being a talk relating to AI, and of course LLMs are the cutting, exciting edge of AI at the moment. Obviously, context is doing some heavy lifting, because context also represents the information that you make available to AI to do things like help you understand your audience or help ideate on creative. So the whole sort of streamlining of the advertising approach comes back to, again, that theme of how the information is grounded in the first place. Where does that context come from? How do you ensure that you're building your decisions, your creative, etc., around something that's grounded in real audience understanding?
Completely.
So we thought we'd run out of time, Dan. We're almost out of slides. I think we're going to have a lot of time for questions.
What I wanted to show actually is then run you through a little bit more in terms of how an approach can be done, what it is that we've done together, and it's this data set that is now out in market that everyone can use. Like I said, this is really, the point here is really to showcase actually that it can be done in an ethical way. The approach that we've taken is we start with a panel essentially. So we have a panel of 10,000 nationally representative people in the UK. They've opted in. It's based and it's UCOM endorsed, so it's approved by the online community. And in terms of the types of data that you can see, we have your obvious demographics. We can understand more about geography. Where are they? How do you target them? You can understand more about their psychographics, how are they thinking and what they're doing. But I think what is really interesting and what's really rich is actually when you start thinking about what are the topics that are trending, what are the interests that are trending, and hence, where are they on that purchasing funnel? And so these are the types of things that we've started working with EntityX, really leveraging kind of AI and technology to help understand audiences in a far stronger and a far more robust way. We're seeing today, for instance, in terms of search is changing. We're seeing that actually the way that people are behaving with LLMs is actually changing how they're thinking about advertising, how they're thinking about their products. With that, using kind of the technologies that you've built really allows us to understand Are they themes? Are lots of people actually searching for those? Or actually is it just kind of something that's just a signal on the wind?
Yeah, and I suppose from my point of view, I think we built at NTX, we built a nice engine for understanding what's going on and linking it to addressable media. But now, by plugging in something like panel data, rather than starting with a media brief and kind of having to make stuff up, you can ground your activity in known attributes of an audience, which I think is really powerful.
What's really interesting, what we see across the board is actually when you start to think about data from a human perspective as opposed to from just a brand lens, actually there are really interesting kind of crossovers that we see. So you take kind of a brand like an HSBC, or you take a brand like a Tesco, they have lots of different products that are trying to target lots of different types of people, but actually understanding kind of them in that moment and what they're trying to do, understanding where they go, actually can give you really, really rich insights as to where you might want to be, or actually things to think about in terms of what you might want to focus on in terms of things that really kind of resonate with people to drive impact.
Yeah, and actually there's really fascinating, unexpected things emerge when you do this kind of analysis based on live media consumption. So the thing with, like, I don't know, the tech bros and the Pilates thing were kind of less interesting because they're more obvious. But we constantly find like really valuable non-obvious things emerging. So as an example, there was some testing we did with Ipsos and the banking client. And they were interested in engaging with, for one of their products was about a credit card for building up credit score. So it was people with a lower income. And around the time the budget came out, sort of the material in the budget isn't the sort of thing a more low-income audience would ordinarily engage with. But because there was a lot of content in the budget relating, impactful for people on a low income, there was a huge amount of engagement with that content. And some of then the co-occurring content in that revealed these sort of interesting different characteristics that I haven't come across before. There was one of them we called the loud budgeters. So people on a restricted income, but rather than that being a source of embarrassment, seeing it as their ability to manage their income and their outgoings and taking pride in their financial management as being something really positive. And the other end of the spectrum, we found a whole cluster around what we called YOLO spending. It was almost like slightly nihilistic spending behaviour, with people thinking, I'm never going to be able to afford a mortgage, I might as well just max out my credit card and go on holiday. And so understanding that the addressable inventory that people are engaging with splits out in those sorts of ways, then opened up loads of ideas around, oh, okay, well, let's have a completely different creative treatment for the loud budgeters versus the YOLO spenders. And we see that sort of thing all the time. So from the foundation, you can the panel data, you can find some really interesting things, but actually seeing what's resonating and how that changes as real events occur in the world and being able to have a window onto that is really exciting.
And I think what's really powerful with that at the same time is when you start thinking about actually the technologies that are out there in terms of, from an advertising standpoint, understanding human behavior, and then you consider the fact that, and one of my passions, I used to work for news organizations. And so quite often today, actually what advertising is doing is actually help to funnel those organizations, which is a really important thing for society. But when you think about the fact that a lot of the technologies now are blocking that, you can actually miss out on key moments. So you think about kind of keyword targeting for that way. If you think about, say, certain words, you think about a watch, for instance, a watch can be watch or a watch can be watching. But context and understanding in terms of the content that's being written or the content that's being delivered actually means there are ways that you can engage in far richer ways. And I think that's a really key thing that technology is really unlocked in that manner.
It is, although some of the habits of media buying are not helpful from that point of view, right? People are still using live in market popular mechanisms for brand safety that just blanket exclude entire publications on sometimes a fairly vaporous basis. Whereas we do now have much better technology for understanding in much more nuance the significance of a page and how a given target audience might relate to it.
Totally agree. So thank you very much. I hope that was very useful. We left some minutes for time for questions. So I don't know if there's anything in the audience. I see there is one just there.
Sorry, just before we get to the audience, just going to check this microphone's on 5. What did you just understand as well? How can people in the audience who are interested in finding out more about these audiences, are they accessible now, are they available in things like DSPs and through media agencies?
Yeah, absolutely. So all of the capabilities we've been showing you are available and live in market. Come and talk to us afterwards, or the QR codes, go to our LinkedIn profiles. We're really happy to talk in more detail.
Yes. So we've got partners already in place. So yes, you can find them in DSPs, and it's a data set that's there to be used. Like I said, just like creativity, the data is only as good as the people that are using it. So hopefully you'll find it's useful and impactful.
Fantastic. So yeah, please do go and search out the DTX and source audience segments in your DSP or ask your media agency for them. So they've got some hands up for some questions. Mario, that's Posse, my favorite person.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the talk. So, if I understood you correctly, like a lot of what you've shown is, I would say, like traditional social methodologies, like social sciences, like panel data, clustering, like cross-province analysis, all that, like we've known those methods for a lot of years. So, what is like, I get the impression that what AI brings to the table here is the ability to interpret, like the written text, like what is the content actually about, and then understanding what they're engaging with, because a lot of the rest I would say like unknown, and maybe something about speed, right? Like bringing it up like into real time.
Please, Nigel.
So there's different ways in which AI is playing a part in this. So a big part for me is getting all of this data. So there are some attributes of the data that are different, I'll talk about in a second. It's getting all of this data into particularly a knowledge graph format that can plug into an LLM. So how do you make the data available without flooding the context window of an LLM such that it can then reason about it? So that was one of the premises of the talk, is how do you enable LLMs to reason on top of culture in a way that has some structure and control behind it? And I think what we're doing here, joining the various data sets together and making that available to an LLM is an important. And it's a big part of how we analyze the data internally to build out things like addressable segments, is by feeding the graph structure into an LLM to help with some of the clustering, for example. You see, the LLMs are really good at the clustering. What you can't necessarily do is just lob all of the data into an LLM and get it to reason about it. So that for me is a big part of it. Another big part of it is the way we're using, so we bring together to help us understand and expand from the panel data, we use a huge structured data set from Wikipedia, so the underlying knowledge graph that underpins Wikipedia and how people browse that data. And we combine that with the programmatic bid stream. So the real time, we get about 2 billion events a day based on ad serving events. And rather than just using that data in the moment, as it normally is for making bid, no bid decisions, is using that also to create this picture of what's happening, being able to link it back to the panel audience and make it addressable. So there's quite a lot of movement. I almost didn't want to go into all of that because it's too detailed.
But I think what crosses together, which is really interesting, is actually the passive data, which is out there, and joining that, which is what you talked about, but also a lot of the verbatim sometimes with the other data that we get from our panelists at the same time. You know, that in the past was quite a heavy lift in terms of trying to read everyone's comments, trying to understand that. Now actually with machine learning, that's actually done far faster. It allows us to create those clusters at speed and also interrogate that data in a much richer way.
It's making it understandable as well, right? So the LLMs are really clever at understanding things semantically in their hidden latent space that's really hard to understand. But having something like a graph representation means it is then possible for A, to constrain what the LLM is doing, and also for us to better reason about and understand what's going on.
Which is also critical from a validation standpoint as well, because you know what you need to do is really QA and QC your data to make sure that it makes sense, and that's one of the things that it helps.
Any other questions on the floor?
Thanks, gentlemen, for that. I think my question is, many brands struggle to differentiate between short-lived social noise, a micro trend, versus something that's genuinely scalable and it's a cultural shift. So based on everything you've been talking about, I think you addressed that a little bit already, Tom. But how do you see us being able to differentiate between what is a global trend with longevity or a cultural shift, really?
I mean, there's the technical part to that, I guess, is good data science. So we are analysing historical data to understand the different characteristic fingerprints of things that are momentary trends versus slow burners, things that have plateaued, things that are on a stratospheric trajectory, etc. So there's there's a lot of signal in the data, and once you split it out, and also split it out through the lens of particular audiences, right, again, being able to do this thing with respect to our particular audience, rather than the data as a whole, there's a lot of signal in there that you can then set about analysing from more of a data science perspective. And we, like I say, we see it as about fingerprinting, how we can train models, ML models, on those different kind of characteristics of movement in the data to help them better spot the difference between, exactly as you're saying, things that are momentary versus big cultural shifts. And having all of that data historically creates a nice space to play in to create those models and test those models, etc.
And the other thing I think that's nice with this data set is it's from a longitudinal data set. So it's constantly on, it's constantly being monitored, it's constantly being evaluated in that way. One of the challenges sometimes where we have a lot of data which comes from mobile phones, for instance, when iOS changes their or updates, for instance, it can cause inadvertent spikes. And it can cause inadvertent things where you think, oh, that's something that's happening, where actually all that's happened is they've made a change. And so that's one of the strengths that we're seeing with this approach.
Is that in terms of like how the metering works for the panels, right?
Completely.
Any other questions from the audience? No? Okay, well.
Thanks for having us.
I've got one more question for you then. And then I might in terms of, thanks, Daniel. Cheers. So in terms of what's coming next, what do you see as being the big developments? And maybe you're already working on it right now. What's the big development which is going to change how advertisers are using this type of data to be able to target their audiences?
Do you want me to go? I mean, I suppose I have a slightly more techie, because I'm a bit of a techie, I have more of a techie perspective on it, which is making this kind of data available in the right sort of structured way, whether it's through command line interfaces or MCP servers or whatever, so that as particularly large brands and the big holdcos, they are investing in AI. They haven't been great at it historically. I'm sure they will get there. How you make this sort of signal available to the machines to use. So, there's a trend now, what's called like headless products, where not everything has a user interface for a human user to use. What's the right way of structuring and making this data available for our new machine friends to use, but in a responsible way, in a way that's still grounded in human interaction and human behaviour?
For me, I think it's the democratization of data, which is what all of these technologies are helping. Very much in the past, the data would sit in siloed departments. Actually, the data is accessible to everyone in that way. It will be more about how can the data be fed through APIs so that it can feed into your systems, that you can use it in the ways and the tools that you've built, as opposed to using maybe the historical tools of the past, which weren't necessarily set up to create it in that manner. So my hope in that way is that, with better data in the world, with everyone having better data to activate on, actually we can drive back and help the media industry. Because I go back to the point when we were talking about keyword targeting. Advertising really does help to sustain a really important part of society, because having that information, be it news, be it entertainment, is really, really vital.
Also, we have the Venn diagram about audience and creative and context. It's really hard to bring those things together because of how siloed media planning and buying is still.
Yeah.
So I think some of these changes are also helping to break down the silos, so that if you've got in one place really interesting insight into audiences and the ability to activate, to take advantage of that, those things have to sit closer together. And I think that is starting to happen in even some of the big holdcos, where for a long time, those themes have been very, very split apart. I think the other thing as well is plugging it into more data. So as more of the content that people interact with, like video content, CTV content, etc., as that becomes available programmatically, it gives us a bigger space of data to understand and analyze human interests, and also to make it addressable, to plug it into the advertising ecosystem in a responsible way.
And that's a really interesting one, because understanding the cross-media ecosystem is a real need, I think, because if you go back to people again, they're consuming in different ways at different times via different formats, via different technologies, via different platforms. And so, again, what this will unlock is that total understanding of people, which is really strong. The other thing, if I put my old publisher hat on as well, is that whilst this data can be used very much from an advertising standpoint, it can also be used from a business strength. So if you think from subscriptions, the data can be used in terms of profiling to try and drive subscriptions in that way. So the use cases for data can really be unlocked in far more broader ways, which is kind of what I'm excited about.